Everybody, welcome to our live webinar. Over the past couple of months, Matthew and I have explored many issues employers are facing in light of COVID-19, and we've looked at the furlough scheme. More recently, I've looked at Furlough, and we've looked at getting employees back to work. A common theme that's run through most of our webinars is us identifying some holiday issues in terms of managing holiday during COVID-19. And therefore, we decided that today, the focus of the webinar will be managing holiday. So the webinar is live, so please do ask questions and we'll answer them as we go through the webinar. And as with our other webinars that we've done, we'll also spend some time at the end dealing with any additional questions that you may have. So, looking at our agenda for this morning, I'm going to look at the relevant legislation which is applicable when considering annual leave. It's accrual and pay. I will also remind us all of the basic principles we need to remember in relation to annual leave. And then Matthew's going to be looking at holiday in the context of furlough and flexible furlough and potential issues that may arise. I'm then going to spend a little bit of time looking at the working time coronavirus amendment regulations, which came into force earlier this year with COVID-19 specifically in mind. The purpose of the regulations is to assist employers manage annual leave and ensure employees are able to take their holiday that they're entitled to. However, as we'll see when I talk about them, we've identified some advantages and disadvantages to the regulations, and I'll explore those a bit later. And then we're going to conclude by Matthew's kindly going to look at some practical considerations at this time and suggest some next steps for tackling the management of holiday within your organisation. So let's look at the relevant legislation. So we look at the Working Time Directive, which is obviously the EU law, the EU legislation. We've got the Working Time Regulations 1998, which I'm sure that you're familiar with, not necessarily the content, but I've certainly heard of the Working Time Regs. So of course that implements the EU directive into UK law. We've got the Employment Rights Act 1996, which is relevant when calculating holiday pay. And of course, as I mentioned, we've got the Working Time regulations, the amendment to the Working Time regulations with coronavirus as the focus. And also, we mustn't forget that we also need to consider European and domestic case law, as this over very recent years in particular has been really significant when looking at holiday. So, for example, Bear Scotland and the implications on calculating holiday pay. Stringer is another really important case because that confirmed the accrual and continued accrual of annual leave during sickness absence. So we do have to keep an eye on case law when looking at annual leave. So what's the current position? Well, all workers and employees in the UK are entitled to, as a minimum, 5.6 weeks paid statutory holiday per holiday year. So for a full-time worker, 5.6 weeks will be 28 days. Okay, so this is comprised of 4 weeks, what we'll call basic leave. So for a full-time worker, 20 days. And it also, and that's the bit that comes from the Working Time Directive, the 20 days, 4 weeks. And then we also have 1.6 weeks additional leave, which is the additional rights for those in the UK, which is found under the Working Time regulations. And so we call that 1.6 weeks, or those 8 days, additional leave. Okay. Employees may have additional entitlement on top of those 5.6 weeks because they may have additional contractual entitlement as well. So the purpose of holiday, the Working Time Directive, is clear that it's to permit employees to enjoy a period of rest and relaxation, and you'll see why that principle is important a little bit later on. So the current position in terms of when leave needs to be taken. So the basic leave, those 20 days, that must be taken in the leave year to which it relates. Otherwise, it is lost. Okay, there are exceptions, for example, in terms of sickness absence, which I will come to. But the current position, the basic principle is that the 20 days must be taken in the leave year in respect of which it's due. The additional leave can be carried forward, so that's the 8 days, the 1.6 weeks, in accordance with a relevant agreement. So if there's a collective agreement, a workforce agreement, or your contract of employment says, 5 days or whatever, or the 8 days can be carried forward, then yes, that's permitted. Okay. There is nothing to prevent an employer from allowing a worker to carry forward unused holiday, whether accrued under the working time regs or under the employment contract, if the worker genuinely doesn't want to take it during that leave year. However, an employer can't force a worker to carry over the statutory holiday if it would infringe the working time regs. So basically, an employer who seeks to compel a worker to carry over the 4 weeks basic leave would be prevented from doing so under the regulations as they were drafted at that time, so that they couldn't do that. Now, there are some circumstances in which case law has established that employees should be permitted to carry over unused statutory holiday to the next year, and sometimes beyond that. So that's where you have employees who are on family-related leave, so for example, maternity leave, and have been unable to take their annual leave due to being on maternity leave in that leave in the holiday year. Workers who've been unable to take holiday due to sickness. So for long-term sick employees, then they can carry it over. But of course, we also now know that there is a cap to that of 18 months. So holiday not used up to within 18 months of the end of the leave year in which it's accrued is lost. And also another couple of exceptions. So for example, where an employer actively prevents an employee or seeks to prevent an employee from taking a holiday, then it must carry over. The other important principle to remember is that an employer should not and cannot make a payment in lieu of annual leave except on the termination of employment, and that's quite important. So I think particularly given the the annual leave store up that's happening, particularly with the number of employees on furlough, some clients have looked at the option of, oh, can we speak to our staff perhaps and say, oh, we'll buy that holiday off you, so we don't have to kind of try and deal with the logistics of it later on. Well, we can't do that in respect of the statutory holiday. If employees have contractual entitlement over and above that, those 28 days or those 5.6 weeks, then yes, potentially we can look at that. That's fine. But you cannot make a payment in lieu in relation to an employee's statutory entitlement. So another look at some more basic principles that are important that we bear in mind. And that's the fact that workers can be required to take or not to take holiday on specified dates as per either a relevant agreement, such as, we can set it out in the contract of employment. So sometimes you'll see in contracts that there are particular shutdown periods that are mentioned, perhaps over summer or over Christmas, where we say that we want our employees to take 3 or 5 or whatever days leave. And we also can require employees not to take or not to take holiday by giving statutory notice. So in terms of requiring an employee to take holiday, employers can give notice requiring an employee to take statutory holiday on specified dates. And the notice needs to be at least twice the length of the period of time you want the worker to take. So for example, if you want one of your employees to take a week's leave, then you need to give them at least 2 weeks notice. Okay. And I know that many organisations are looking at this, particularly for their staff that are on furlough, and looking at issuing them with notice to require them to use up some of their annual leave during furlough. This obviously helps with the management of holiday and also will help with the cost of annual leave, because of course you get the 80%, subject to the cap of course, but you get kind of the 80% contribution from the CJRS. Okay. We also have provisions, statutory provisions, which allows an employer to order a worker not to take holiday on specified dates. So if an employee has booked holiday, then the employer must give as many days notice as a period of holiday to which the notice relates. So let's break that down into English. So if an employee books or has booked 5 days leave and we wish to cancel those 5 days leave, we need to give notice at least 5 calendar days before the date on which that leave was due to start. So we can effectively cancel workers' leave. However, whilst requiring employees to take leave is likely to be unpopular, short cancellations of leave is likely to be even more unpopular and damage morale, particularly, especially if an employee's got pre-booked exotic holiday or any kind of overseas holiday or anything that they've spent money on. And if if we're unreasonable in our approach on this, then obviously there's the potential argument that an employee may make in terms of a breach of the implied term of trust and confidence, and obviously potential constructive unpaid dismissal. So what I suggest is if you do need your employees to cancel some holiday, we have a sensible discussion with them first to see if we can reach agreements and use these notice provisions as a last resort. So holiday accrues, as I've mentioned, during sickness, absence and maternity leave, and it also accrues during furlough, but I'll leave that bit to Matthew to clarify very shortly. Now, holiday pay. So under the working time regs, workers are entitled to be paid during their statutory annual leave at a rate of a week's pay for a week's leave in accordance with the complicated week's pay rules, which are found in the Employment Rights Act. Now, the European and domestic case law has clarified what should be included in holiday pay, in particular for those with normal working hours. This is a huge topic and not one I'm going to go into any detail this morning. But as I mentioned already, the Bear Scotland case and the subsequent case law has clarified that the Working Time Directive requires workers to receive their normal remuneration during that 4 weeks leave. Okay, so that's when we start looking at the inclusion of overtime and commission. So as I said, just very, very briefly, as this is a huge topic in itself, but a brief reminder, a summary of the Employment Rights Act and a week's pay. So workers with no normal working hours, so those with variable hours, we need to average their pay over the last 52 weeks. So in April this year, that reference period changed from 12 weeks to 52 weeks. So we now need to calculate the average over 52 weeks. Okay, for those employees or workers with normal working hours, then we need to calculate a week's pay by reference to those hours. Now, previously, we understood the position to be, right, well, that's just, basic salary. But obviously, as I've mentioned, the case law that has occurred in the EU and domestic case law, we now know that actually we need to be looking at whether there's any overtime, including voluntary, if sufficiently regular, any commission, potentially looking at bonuses, shift allowance and things, because these all may well need to be included when calculating holiday pay. Okay, so that is a whistle-stop tour through annual leave and holiday legislation. Not the most thrilling topic, but I think you'll see as we move on, it's important just to remind ourselves of these basic principles, because we do need to keep going back to them when we look at what we can do to manage annual leave during this time. Now, before I move over to Matthew, who's going to look at holiday and furlough, we did have one question that came in prior to the webinar starting this morning, and that question relates to flexible furlough, but I thought I would just answer it now before we move on to furlough. So the question says, and I'm paraphrasing it, but it says that we understand that from the 1st of July, we can furlough part-time, but this must be at least 7 days, but there must be at least 7 days in any one claim. We want to stay closed on Saturdays, and so we will only be looking to furlough 4 days a month. Can we do this? So where the question mentions that they believe there must be at least 7 days in any one claim, that is right, but only in relation to submitting claims. So under the flexible furlough scheme, when submitting your claim under the scheme for your grant, your claim periods need to be for at least 1 week. There isn't any minimum or maximum furlough days or work days that need to be in that claim. It's just that your actual claim period needs to be for a minimum of a week. And I guess that's just to prevent employers kind of submitting claims for ad hoc days on ad hoc basis. It seems the scheme want, something a bit neater and tidier in that claim period, actually for a week. Okay, but there is no restrictions on the working pattern that you may choose to implement under flexible furlough. So, Matthew, are you okay to move on to holiday and furlough for us, please?
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Vanessa. Going back to those awful days in March when we first learned about the CJRS and the steps that the government was going to take to prop up the economy during the lockdown, we were getting to grips very quickly with an awful lot of new regulations coming out from the government. And there were lots of things at that time which we had to speculate about or ask ourselves the question, well, what about this? What about that? And certainly when we started looking at furlough in that context, one of the big things was holiday and how holiday and holiday rights would work during a furlough period. I'm pleased to say that when we moved to July, there are certain questions which have been pretty much answered, and we no longer need to speculate about. So what do we know? Well, we know that holiday continues to accrue during furlough. That's certainly the case with the holiday under the working time regulations. I think it would be possible for an employer to say, well, contractual holiday over and above those 5.6 weeks, which Vanessa talked about, do not continue to accrue. But I think you'd actually have to be pretty explicit about the fact that that doesn't accrue, and I think for most employers it wouldn't be worthwhile. Secondly, and this was a big one because what employers obviously did not want to do was disentitle themselves to payments under the CJRS if employees took holiday when they shouldn't, but holiday can be taken during furlough. And again, that's been something which has been very useful for employers. Thirdly, we know that furlough pay should be topped up to 100%, assuming, of course, that the employee is on reduced amount of pay during furlough. Actually, I think that's a bit of a shorthand way of putting it. What the guidance actually says is what you do when calculating holiday pay is calculate it in the way in which you normally would, rather than just sort of taking the 80% and adding 20% on top. And there's a few cases where that has produced rather odd results, and I'm also aware of a number of employers who are just taking the 80% and grossing up to 100. But effectively, if an employee is on holiday whilst on furlough, then the employer has to pay out a bit more. And finally, as Vanessa has said, employers can require leave to be taken or indeed cancelled as usual during furlough. But it's of course important that you're either following the powers you have to do that in the contract, and if you've got nothing in the contract, then you're falling back on those working time regulations permissions. So that's the sort of the basic position. And then of course we had the issue of bank holidays and what happens with bank holidays, because furlough CJRS at its height has been during a period where we had 4 bank holidays. We had the Easter weekend, and then we had the May bank holidays, and employers have had to consider that. And this is something which, even though those days have gone, I think is going to continue to unravel a bit for some employers who weren't necessarily completely au fait with this at the time. So what did we have? Well, for many employees, of course, a bank holiday is not designated as a day's holiday. It's a usual working day unless the employee decides to take it as holiday. And on those days, employers would have had to have given notice if they wanted the employee to take that as a day's leave. What about those employees who have contracts which entitles them to take bank holiday as annual leave? Well, I think if those contracts exist, then effectively Easter Friday, Easter Monday, and the main bank holidays would have defaulted to being days of holiday. And if we apply the furlough rules on top of that, then the employer is required to up the pay for those days to 100%. Or alternatively, I think, to say to the employee, well, we had you on furlough at 80%, and this may be it's certainly important for those employers who are cash strapped at the moment. we're going to leave it as a furlough day, and we're going to refund you that day of annual leave for you to take at some point in the future. I think either is legitimate on those bases. And as I said, the effect of those days being holiday, if they were taken as holiday, is to pay at the full rate. So again, I think we've got a reasonably sustained certain position when it comes to bank holidays. And then we move into dear old Flexi Furlough, which has us all pulling our hair out and trying to get to grips with the rules. As you'll know, from the 1st of July, it's a much more relaxed furlough scheme. Employees can effectively be furloughed for days at a time and work, so having a part-time furlough scheme effectively, and the employer pays for those hours that are worked and then receives the grant for the furloughed hours. So what that means, I think, is that you can have an employee who wants to take a week off. If they're furloughed effectively for 3 of those days and are working 2 of those days, then they only have to use 2 of their days holiday to be able to take a week off. Given the fact that holiday accrues during furlough, we are, of course, going to have a situation where holiday is building up for those employees, because they will be taking many fewer days as holiday. I think we have to just be aware that this may be an advantage to those employees who are on flexi furlough, as opposed to those employees who have been working certainly full-time throughout the lockdown, because they, of course, are still going to have to take 5 days leave to be able to take the same amount of time away from work. So I think we may have an issue there with some perceived unfairness, and trying to manage that from an employee relations issue, I think, is something we just need to be aware of, particularly as flexi furlough is clearly going to be applying over the summer months. This is an issue which there is a degree of uncertainty about, and in the way in which these things tend to happen, we prepare a seminar or a webinar yesterday, and the government issues new guidance this morning. And thank you, Sheila, from our team, for sending us an email at 10 to 10 this morning with the updated guidance around furlough and flexi furlough and holiday. We're still getting to grips with that. Looking at it, there aren't any very significant changes that we need to be aware of. It looks to me as if they're just tinkering and clarifying some of the language. So we think the basic position remains as it always is. And I think the purpose of the guidance, the revised guidance, is to say you can't retrospectively use flexible or furlough days to enable an employee to take leave. If an employee's got it booked off as holiday and has always had it booked off at holiday, and they're not, and that wasn't going to be a day on which they're designated to be furloughed, then you can't sort of put in your claim to the CJRS later in the month and claim that there was a furlough day. I think that's the effect of the change. So if it's booked as holiday, that's fine. If it was always booked as holiday on a furlough day, again, that's fine. You can claim your 80% for that day. But what you can't do is retrospectively designate a day as furlough, which had always been planned to be holiday. I think that's the effect. If there's any change to that, what we'll do is we'll make sure we issue some further guidance notes accordingly. So that's where we go in terms of holiday and furlough. And as I said, flexi furlough adds another dimension to the holiday issues at this stage. But government did anticipate that, of course, that there were going to be significant effects on holiday as a result of this. And I'm going to pass back to Vanessa, who's going to look at some of what the government anticipated by their amendments to the working time regs. So over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Matthew. So yes, the government was quite quick off the mark, actually, and they introduced emergency legislation on the 26th of March earlier this year, relaxing the restrictions on carrying over annual leave. So the purpose is to allow businesses under particular pressure from the impact of COVID-19 the flexibility to manage their workforce whilst also at the same time the amendments seek to protect workers' rights to paid leave. So what do the amendments do? Well, they temporarily amend the carryover rules set out in the working time regs. And they, in particular, relax the current carryover provisions for the basic 4 weeks leave. They apply to employees and all types of workers. So, for example, agency workers, 0 hours, all workers covered. And so basically they allow the 4 weeks basic leave to be carried over where in any leave year it was not reasonably practicable for a worker to take some or all of the leave to which the worker was entitled as a result of the effects of coronavirus, including on the worker, the employer, or the wider economy or society. And they also say that the carried over leave under the amendment regs may be taken in the 2 leave years immediately following the leave year in respect of which it was due. So originally it was thought that perhaps these amendment to the working time regs would only apply to key workers because of course they were the ones that were on the front line and were needed desperately. For example, their NHS staff and such forth. However, the regulations do not make this distinction, and therefore we're now comfortable to say that it's safe to say that they apply equally to all organisations and all types of employees, so regardless of sector. Okay. The regulations ensure that on termination, the worker will be paid in lieu of any untaken carried over holiday. Okay. So you can see that if an employer allows the workers to carry over a substantial amount of their leave this holiday year into the next holiday year, and then early on into the next holiday year, employment is terminated, you can see that there's potential for quite a big bill there in respect of payment in lieu of untaken holiday. In order to refuse requests to take the carried over leave, so the leave is carried over into the next holiday year, an employee seeks to book it, the employer wants to refuse the request. Under the regs, the amendment regs, the employer must have a good reason to be able to do so. So this could potentially be an issue for you later on, later holiday years when looking at when looking at managing holiday and whether you can refuse the leave or not. And I'll come on to a good reason shortly. So as I said, the purpose of these amendment regulations is so that employers feel that they can kind of refuse holiday at the moment to ensure business continuity in this holiday year and meet potentially, business demands that are on them, perhaps maybe more and higher business demands as a result of the coronavirus, whilst also, of course, the purpose is to ensure workers are still able to benefit from their holiday at another time, i.e. that they don't lose their annual leave. As things stand at the moment, obviously, if you're able to kind of fit in the annual leave that employees are requesting, then we suggest that perhaps, you continue to operate your normal policy and encourage staff to take their holiday within the current leave year. I think certainly that'll be easier to manage in the long run, but obviously you'll need to, consider carryover where it seems appropriate to do so in the circumstances. So what are the issues that we've identified with these amendment regulations? Well, they've been drafted pretty widely to allow for a broad interpretation, and it's likely easily to be met, i.e., the reason for the need to carry over just needs to be related to COVID-19. There's no kind of real specific details as to how business needs to be affected. However, of course, each situation needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis. I think when we're looking at the requirement to have a good reason to refuse carried over holiday, there is no definition of what a good reason is. There's no full explanation. I would have thought that, genuine operational requirements is likely to be sufficient. So if you have someone who's looking to book holiday, been carried over, and you want to refuse it, then, if you've already got a number of employees who have already got pre-booked holiday, then of course we would say that's a good reason to refuse that holiday. There is also no definition of what's reasonably practicable. So there's no definition of where it would not be reasonably practicable for a worker to take holiday. But it's clear that there does need to be a link between the reason why holiday can't be taken and coronavirus, but nothing really further than that. So there's been some ACAS guidance, been guidance from the government as to, factors to take into consideration when potentially declining or approving holiday. So obviously, if we're looking to potentially decline holiday and it needs to roll over to the next holiday year, that could be due to an increased demand in work, requiring the worker to continue to be at work and not take holiday. It could be because there's been a disruption to the business and we need to ensure that the business covers essential activities. We do need to take into consideration the worker's health and how soon they may need a period of rest and relaxation. Another critical factor may, of course, be the length of time remaining in the holiday year. So there may be many that perhaps the holiday year ended at the end of April, and then the coronavirus came in March, and then of course we have furlough, or for a key worker, there's demands to not take holiday, and sometimes employees have this wonderful tendency to not take their annual leave until right at the end of the holiday year, where they lose it rather than use it. So the length of time remaining in the holiday year is quite an important factor, because of course for those holiday years that perhaps but like the calendar year to the end of this year, then there may well be plenty of opportunity for them to take annual leave before the end of the holiday year. We've also got those employees who are self-isolating or who may be too sick to take holiday before the end of the leave year. So the government's got those in mind. And also the government said that we should consider the extent to which the worker taking leave would impact on the wider society's response to and recovery from COVID-19. I think their point there, I think that bit is kind of directed at, the key workers, the ones that we need to continue working during this time to help our recovery. So when calculating how much holiday a worker can carry forwards, employers must give workers the opportunity to take any leave that they cannot carry forward before the end of the leave year, i.e. the 1.6 weeks additional leave and or additional contractual holiday. If you don't do this, we could face, carrying over significantly more than the 4 weeks entitlement. I mean, what I'm getting here is that, obviously your contracts may already have some carryover provisions. So they may say, for example, you can carry over 5 days a year. And I think, let's move on to the advantages and disadvantages, actually, because I'll probably explain a little bit more. So if we look at the advantages the amendment regulations give us, of course, they help us support business continuity. And it avoids the risk of, a significant proportion of the workforce wanting to take holiday at the same time, because we can roll it forwards and kind of spread it out over the next couple of holiday years. Risk of financial penalties reduced. Well, so basically the obligation to ensure workers can take their holiday within the, this holiday leave year is relaxed. So it allows us to better manage our workforce and ensure that we're not short-staffed at key times. We also have, from the workers' perspective, obviously it's reassuring them that holiday won't be lost, and so perhaps they'll be more amenable to us refusing requests. And of course, from their perspective, I guess as many of us dying to jump on a plane and escape for a little while and sit on a sun lounger or go and explore and just do something. And I think, obviously another advantage is perhaps this means a holiday can be taken at a time when, these quarantine restrictions or international restrictions are lifted. But the disadvantages, well, as I've already mentioned, we are potentially storing up a large bill for payments in lieu of holiday if we allow a significant amount of holiday to be carried over to the next holiday year. We also now have the regulations kind of creating an additional hurdle or perhaps limiting our ability to refuse an employee taking leave on a particular day we're looking at the carried over holiday hour, we need that good reason. So the other thing is, what about those that are unable to take holiday due to sick leave or maternity leave? So those that are returning from long-term sick or returning from maternity absence. It doesn't necessarily apply to them because, of course, we're looking at holiday that's been affected, due to coronavirus. And then you've got a maternity leaver maternity person who returns, in the next holiday year, and you've allowed your other workforce to carry over a substantial amount of holiday due to the coronavirus. You can see that actually you're going to kind of create some more issues in terms of trying to manage all of this holiday. And essentially, it potentially defers the problem to a later date if we do just allow a large amount of holiday for different employees to be carried over. So therefore, we would say, if possible, encourage staff, and if you can, allow staff to take their leave in the holiday year to which it relates. And certainly when we're looking at leave that's been carried over and such forth, the best practice is to allow staff to take leave for the holiday that expires first. So if leave's been carried over, and obviously we know that needs to be taken within 2 years of the holiday year it relates to, potentially we could be facing, staffing challenges 2021, 2020, 2022. So kind of pushing that problem later along the road. And I think also when it comes to like managing holiday, it's potentially going to become a little bit complicated keeping track of what people have carried over. If they're taking holiday, the subsequent holiday year, which annual leave are they taking? Are they taking the bit that they've carried over, or are they taking the bit out of this holiday year's entitlement? So managing that and tracking that could be a little bit of a headache for you. So I would say, manage it carefully and communicate clearly with your employees. And what I was going to say is that I would then pause on the practical parts and let Matthew to look at the practical tips now. But I see we've got a couple of questions.
We have, Vanessa. Shall I give you those? So,
yes,
good questions, actually. If we have encouraged staff to take leave, but they have just decided not to, can we refuse carryover?
I think potentially we can, because we would say that they were able to take annual leave during the holiday year to which it relates, and that it was reasonably practical for you to take the leave. So I would say, as long as we're sure that you're able to accommodate the leave, then yes, we can encourage staff to take the leave. And of course, don't forget, we also have those notice provisions that we can require employees to take leave if we give them the sufficient notice under the statute.
Yeah, I agree. I think the one situation where we might be in a bit more difficulty are just those where there's a bit of a disconnect between what the HR team say in terms of encouraging people to take leave, and then what the line managers say to their staff about workloads and everything else. And I suppose if at ground level the message has been given, yeah, you can take leave if you want, but you haven't got the time, even if the formal message is we want everyone to take leave, then that's where there may be some difficulties. But I think, yeah, in principle, if you've encouraged staff, they haven't done it, then you can refuse a carryover. Next question: if an employee has been on furlough for the whole time and had booked holiday but not asked for that to be cancelled, does the employer have to allow them to take the holiday later, despite having up the 80% to 100% salary for that time? An exam question.
That is, isn't it? So employees on furlough, they've had booked holiday for that time. We've done the right thing, that we've topped up the pay to 80% to 100%. So both parties have recognised that holiday has been taken. When can an employee turn around and say, no, actually, I didn't take the holiday. That was furlough, not holiday, and I want to take it at a later date? The only argument I can see them potentially seeking to rely on is this concept of, well, actually, I was on furlough leave. There was lockdown, particularly probably more relevant for kind of the March-April period. It was not a period of rest and relaxation. I was stuck inside my house and it was very, very stressful. And therefore, I should be able to take my holiday at a later date. I think, there is a potential for that argument to be run. So I suppose really the key for me would be, when was that taken? When was that holiday taken? Because certainly if it's been taken, say July, when all being well, there's no local lockdown, but we've got pubs and restaurants and shops and such forth open, then I think that argument for me won't have much mileage at all.
Yeah, agree. It's one of those, I think, where the employer can apply a principle and 90% of the cases will fall within it. But there may be some exceptions, and it's just worth being alert to those exceptions, I think, isn't it?
So do you want to move on to some practical considerations, Matthew?
Yeah, some of these we've dealt with before, but I thought it was worthwhile just rounding up, looking at them, and then looking at perhaps what we do with them. And I think what we do with them is, first of all, look at the contract. Secondly, look at our holiday policies. So just in terms of those practical considerations, and Vanessa has already referred to the fact that by allowing carryover, are we just storing up a problem for future years? It might be a practical problem, but there could also be a financial problem, because of course, since this is where I become an accountant rather than a lawyer, so bear with me, since FRS 102 came into force, the effect of that is that companies must accrue as a liability untaken holiday on their balance sheet at the end of the financial year. So effectively, it doesn't hit cash, but it hits your balance sheet, and is a liability. So the more holiday that's been accrued but not taken, then the greater that liability is going to be on the balance sheet. Now, that may be something which is immaterial. It may just be something which is coming out as a as a minor issue. But I think it requires there to be a degree of discussion, at least, between the HR team writing the policies about carryover of holiday and what happens there, and the team responsible for preparing the annual accounts, just to make sure that this isn't going to sort of come and hit someone from left field at a later date and have a significant effect on the balance sheet. So just watch that one. We do need to remember that it's not just people on furlough, or not just people who are busy covering for those on furlough who are potentially storing up large amounts of annual leave. We've got the situation we've always had with those on long periods of absence for maternity leave, family-related leave, etc. And again, we are already seeing, I think, an increase in assertions of unfairness, of discrimination, and it would seem to me that whatever we need to do there needs to be a degree of consistency in how we're treating different groups in terms of carry forward, in terms of allowing them to take holiday, and whose holiday is prioritized, etc. Which really comes to the next thing, which I think if there have been long periods where employees have not taken holiday, then we're probably going to find that everyone wants to take holiday at the same time. It's a bit like everyone will want to go to the pub on Saturday night. Everyone will want to go to Lanzarote once the air corridor is established, and so there will be lots of holiday requests coming in at the same time. And I think again that's something which is going to have to be managed, whether it's a first come first served or whatever. But again, worth just thinking about in advance. Vanessa's already asked the question about whether or not staff will be able to cancel leave which they've already booked. I think this is going to be a significant one, particularly if we find that there are rolling lockdowns, not just in the UK but internationally, or short-term quarantine rules established for particular countries. Are we going to allow staff to cancel once they've booked it, if in particular the reason for cancellation is coronavirus related, or is it just going to be something which is tough luck? If you find that your holiday to Lanzarote can't go ahead at short notice, are you just going to have to spend it at home? And that again, one is, I think, which is in the employer's discretion, but it's one which employers, I think, need to be clear about how they're handling it from an employee relations perspective. Also, and again, we've seen this coming through quite significantly, actually, in terms of quarantine and what's going to happen with quarantine. If I want to go to somewhere for a week, somewhere abroad for a week, but when I come back, I am going to have to spend 14 days in quarantine. How is that quarantine going to be treated? Am I going to have to book effectively 3 weeks off work for that 1 week holiday? Am I going to be able to say for that 2 weeks I'll be able to work from home? What happens if part of the organization, because of the nature of the work, has the ability to work from home and the other half doesn't? How are we going to resolve that one? Don't have the answer to that. I think there are numerous ways of dealing with it, all of which leave certain groups probably feeling more grumpy than some others in the workplace. But it should be thought of in advance, and I think if insofar as you can, a policy put in place. Also, I think just in terms of carrying forward holiday, again, particularly if there are significant amounts of holiday, we just have to think that the holiday employees take in future years may be more expensive than the holiday they take now, as pay is reviewed upwards. Now, actually, at the moment, that may seem a sort of a distant prospect. I don't think there's going to be very significant pay rises for many people over the next couple of years. But again, we just need to be aware that there are consequences of carrying forward large amounts of holiday. So there's some of the practical issues. I suppose the question then is, how do we start to deal with these? Well, clearly we need to understand, I think, more clearly who has taken what holiday and when, so that we can ensure there is a degree of consistency. So making sure staff records are clear, looking at who has been very good about taking holiday, look at who appears not to have bothered to take it, and perhaps having some individual conversations to make sure everyone is doing what they need to do is important. We've already had the question about encouraging staff to take their holiday. I think certainly when you look at some of the court cases on this, what the courts have always done is to say it's not enough just to have the form. It's not enough just to say, yeah, we really want you to take holiday. You've got to make sure staff have got the space to take holiday, and that there is that consistent message coming through the organisation about that. In terms of refusing leave requests, particularly if they are coronavirus related, I think we do have to have some kind of record of the reasons why we're refusing holiday. And that really brings us to the final point, which we think is really, really important, which is just to revisit holiday provisions, both in contracts and your holiday policies. So what should we be looking at in terms of the contract? Well, Vanessa's talked about the working time regulation default position, which is notice periods to require employees to take holiday or to cancel holiday. They can be shortened by putting a contractual provision in place, and it's certainly worthwhile having a look at those. They're one of the things which many of us look at, and it becomes a boilerplate clause. We just sort of stick it in there, don't we, saying, yeah, we can in certain circumstances require you to take holiday or not. And I've seen numerous of those clauses over the past few months for various reasons, and trying to adhere to them can be quite difficult, and actually more restrictive than the working time regulations default provisions. So it's certainly worthwhile just revisiting those and making sure that it's as clear as possible that you can require employees to take holiday on relatively short notice, and it will give you more tools in your armory just to manage that particular liability. I think it would be possible, I think this is probably quite an unpopular option, but it would be possible to have a contract which ensured that for long periods of absence, including furlough absence, only working time regulations holiday was going to accrue, contractual holiday was not. And where that may be relevant, I suppose, is for those employers in particular who give the 5.6 weeks or more plus bank holidays. And you could look at putting in a clause, for example, that said if you're on furlough whilst there's a bank holiday, then that is not holiday. It's not accrued as holiday, for example. And again, another one which has come up, and again, this is something which is very live for many employers, particularly those that are looking at large-scale redundancy, particularly those looking at redundancy during the continuation of the CJRS, so as to exclude their or to reduce their liability to notice, looking at making sure you have the right to require staff to take holiday during their notice periods, you know, so that you do not have those potentially large accrued holiday pay amounts to pay out on termination of employment. If you haven't got that clause in the contract, you've got to fall back on the working time regs rules. That can be difficult. Better to have a provision in the contract. Clearly, it's unrealistic to think that you can do a contract negotiation like that at the same time as going through a redundancy exercise. But you know, just for learning sort of the lessons for today for the future, that's something which I think is worth putting in contracts in the future. So looking again, when you come to review your contracts, at just how we're going to be giving ourselves as much flexibility in terms of holiday as possible. I think for the immediate, and I think this is more important perhaps than looking at changing your contracts, is to get that holiday policy in place. I think it's really important, just from an employee relations perspective, just from looking at ensuring that employees are treated consistently and they know where they stand, that there is a holiday process, holiday policy, which takes into account the extreme events we've had recently and the effect of those. So I think you can look at how you're going to deal with conflicting holiday requests. You might just have a first come first serve approach. You might do that on a departmental basis, etc. You may also look at who is approving holiday, just to make sure that there is a consistency there. You may look at how you're going to take into account the period for which people can book holidays. We talked a moment about the fact that if you go abroad, you might turn a 1-week holiday into a 3-week holiday because of the isolation quarantine rules that apply on the back of that. However, many employers have a policy which is you can't take more than 2 weeks holiday at any one time. So are we going to change that? Are we going to try to take into account the potential for quarantine in those situations? Again, we might want to just go further in terms of when holiday may be refused. There may be particular times. It may be a case that if we end up in a lockdown, then no holiday will be approved until we know what the period of lockdown is likely to be, what the consequences are, etc. And also, when you formulated your policy in terms of the carryover, again, it's just worth making sure that's communicated by way of the holiday the holiday provisions, particularly back to the question we had a minute ago. If your carryover is only going to be permitted in circumstances where employees have not had the opportunity to take that holiday when you've encouraged them to do so. So making it very clear to employees when they have got to use it or lose it, I think will be important. So number of things I think we need to do just to ensure that we are getting our holiday policies ready for the next year, 2 year, 3 years, because I think holiday is going to have quite a long tail in terms of this. Even if we end up with a miracle vaccine for COVID-19 quite quickly, we're still going to be dealing with the consequences for some time to come. So I'd encourage looking at holiday policy. We put a couple of resources up there which are worthwhile having a look at. As I said, the second of those has just been updated today. So like I say, can't really see any very significant change as a result of that update. But if you want to ensure you're keeping fully up to speed on it, have a look at those. I can see we've got one question. Is quarantine classed as self-isolation and therefore sick leave rather than annual leave? Not from a statutory sick pay perspective. I think it's up to employers to classify it as they wish, and I think there are a number of ways. First of all, I think you could say, well, from a quarantine perspective, first of all, unless you've booked it as holiday, then we're going to be treating it as unauthorized absence. That would seem a way in which you could do it. You could treat it as unpaid leave, and say it's, if you are going to take it as if you're going to take a week and you are going to be quarantined as a result of that, then you are you're going to have to take that as unpaid, or you could have some kind of hybrid approach, which is to maybe reduce pay for a bit. You could have a situation where you are enabling some employees to continue to work because they can work from home, but saying to others, sorry, you can't work from home, therefore that quarantine period is going to have to be taken as holiday or nothing. I think there's a number of options, but it's certainly not treated in the same way as having to self-isolate because you have been in contact with someone with COVID-19. So I think that's all I wanted to say. Vanessa, I'll pass back to you just for any closing comments.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Thank you to those that have asked us questions this morning. Really good questions this morning that we received. So what I would kindly ask you to do is when the webinar finishes, there'll be a little pop-up which just asks you to rate the webinar and provide any comments. So I'd kindly ask you just to take 10 or 20 seconds just to complete that for us. We are going to send you a follow-up email, which will come out either later today or tomorrow, which will have a recording of the webinar. And it will also have two things attached to it. One will be a link to where I kindly pester you to see whether you can provide us any further feedback, because in particular, there's a question on there as to any other topics you would like covered. And so please do let us know of that. And also what we're doing at the moment is we are preparing a briefing note on managing annual leave. And so what we'll do is when you receive the email from us, we'll also attach that for you as well. And so that will hopefully give you some more guidance and tips for this difficult topic. So thank you all for listening and attending this morning. And we will hopefully see your names again soon. If you have any follow-up questions, then please do submit them, as some of you have been doing, and I'll be more than happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye, everyone.